Story 1. After 3 appointments, I knew every TV show she liked to watch, her relationship status, and how many kids she had. And she forgot that both of my parents had died when I was a child and kept asking, "And who is that again?" When I would say my partner's name. Story 2. Me. When my dad walked out for good without speaking to me, I was so upset. I thought he didn't love me anymore. You wouldn't have thought that. 12-year-olds don't think like that. Awkward silence. Me, okay, this isn't working for me. I'm leaving. Story 3. My first therapist was awful. She would answer her phone and text during our sessions. But the final straw was when I brought up something I wasn't able to move past. And she said, "I don't understand why you are bringing this up again. Just get over it." I never went back after that and found another therapist who has been amazing and supportive. Story 4. Literally my first time meeting him. I am a female. We do general intake stuff and talk about family structure that includes my brother and sister-in-law that live locally. At the end of the session, he asks for my plans for the weekend. I mention a really nerdy, cool, and very niche small event they throw each Christmas that is open to the public, ages 21 and over, with tickets. He starts asking more about the event, and I just assume he thinks the event sounds cool, which it is. So I answer easily about where it is at, times, and ticket prices. Then he says he is going to buy a ticket and will look for me to sit together. This is a man I just met that I plan to process trauma with, and on day 1 he breaks all professional boundaries and mentions meeting up outside of the counseling setting. I skipped the event and did not go back to him. Also lodged a complaint. Story 5. I tried to get my mom to go to therapy with me for months to work on communicating without arguing. She finally agreed. I was elated. We got there, and the woman accidentally gave away that she knew my mom. My mom was a child psychologist, and this woman's office was right down the road from where she worked until retirement. Seemed rigged. I know that sounds crazy, but the lady seemed to be on my mom's team and had a preconceived notion about me being the problem. She seemed puzzled when my mom exhibited behavior instigating problems, and I realized that they knew each other and something was wrong. Come to find out, it was my mom's therapist she had been seeing before this meeting. She pretended to have never met my mom, and they proceeded to lecture me. It was weird. Mom admitted it, and it was very disturbing. I am never going back there, that's for sure. Story 6. She kept venting to me about her own life every single time I opened up. The last time I ever went, she complained to me about one of her friends who was being catty with her. I can't remember exactly what it was, and she pulled out her cell phone and actually let me hear a voicemail the woman had left her, then went off venting about it for an uncomfortable amount of time. She was talking to me like we were out at a bar drinking together, and that's not what I was paying a $50 copay for. It was beyond unhelpful, and I never went back to therapy. Story 7. During my first marriage, our couples counselor dozed off. We thought maybe it was just a bad day and decided to give them a second chance. Next session, same thing. While he was napping, we got up to leave, which woke him up. He asked where we were going and told us if we left, he would charge us a fee for a missed appointment. We laughed at him and told him to go ahead and try. We left and never went back. Story 8. I expressed my fear that my husband had strangled me and injured my back and that it would escalate. She said, "He knows how far he will go. You need to trust that he's a good person who would never kill you, even if he hurts you sometimes." Bye, Felicia. Story 9. Asked a series of questions from his desk with his back to me, including, "Do all 3 of your kids have the same father? I've just come out of retirement part-time." Hands me a sheaf of paper. "Here are some Bible verses that will help." Story 10. She kept making faces at me when I talked, made wild, overreaching conclusions that were actually the opposite of how I felt, but she didn't listen to that and just ran with her ideas. Kept getting people's names wrong and then looked annoyed when gently corrected. After I left, she kept trying to persuade me to stay, using some guilt tripping, and emailed me a few times since, for example, 6 months later asking if I wanted to come back. This was actually helpful to realize that it was the right choice. Story 11. My aunt went to a therapist after her mother was diagnosed with dementia. The therapist said that her grandmother's dementia was a gift. My aunt is very outspoken and expressed her anger to the therapist. then stormed out. Unfortunately, my mother used this as her main reason not to go to therapy herself, which she desperately needed. Story 12. My first experience with therapy, I was about 27. First intake meeting, met with this woman who was a doctor of philosophy. I'm not sure exactly her title, but anyway, she's going over my history, just general life questions. Then we come to the topic of domestic violence assault that I experienced when I was 24. She stopped us mid-conversation to call Child Protective Services. Said she was a mandated reporter. I reminded her I was 24 when this happened, and the person was currently serving a 14-year sentence. When Child Services told her there was nothing they could do because a child wasn't involved and no one was in danger, she then proceeded to call Adult Protective Services. I left in tears, and never once have I ever even considered getting much-needed therapy again. This was about a decade ago. Story 13. Had me spend the entirety of a 55-minute appointment shuffling through a deck of coping skill cards. Then make 3 piles. Yes, I'll try this coping strategy. No, I won't. Or maybe I will. Then, out of the maybe pile, move them to yes or no. Out of the yes pile, I had 30. Take 30 plain note cards, paint them with watercolor paint in whatever way I wanted, and copy the strategy onto the card in permanent marker, so I had my own deck of coping strategies. I am not a creative person. I was dying inside. She sat there the entire time working on her computer. Never went back and threw the cards in the trash. Story 14. I thought I should talk to someone about the physical and sexual abuse that I endured and how I can heal. This is my story. My therapist. Here are some handouts on eating healthy and losing weight. Story 15. Didn't leave that instant for some reason, but to date, she is the only person who has told me it was my fault I got raped. Then followed it up by saying I was playing the victim when I told her rape was never the victim's fault. Story 16. That my nausea, vomiting daily, and constant pain were because my mother died 6 years beforehand. Cost me my medical leave from work, too. I was required to see a psychiatrist, and she said that and denied my leave. Story 17. I was telling her about my friend who had found a good guy and was moving to the Netherlands. She interrupted me to ask if I have ever been, and said that their ethnicity has been tainted with all the foreigners. I was very shocked to process what she said and carried on with my story. The next time I went there, after missing a session, I told her I wished to stop as I no longer respect her as a person since her comment was racist. She laughed in my face, saying she is not racist because her kids play with foreign children and that I am the racist for thinking this way. I obviously never went back. Story 18. Not a therapist but a psychiatrist. She recommended a new kind of treatment which was basically a book. Ordered the book to check it out. The author is the leader of a local cult, and the book is just propaganda and an invitation to the cult. Story 19. Mental health nurse rather than therapist. This happened when I was 17. During a bad depressive episode, I arrived at my first appointment with this nurse with a lump in my throat. I felt tearful a lot during that time in my life, and I was trying really hard not to cry. The nurse asked me why I was there, and I struggled to answer. I couldn't find the words, and my throat was constricting in an effort to suppress my tears, making it really hard to talk. She immediately got upset with me and snapped, "If you won't talk, I can't help you." Later in the session, I mentioned that I wondered if medication would help me. She snapped back again, "Doctors don't hand them out like sweets." I swear I felt a part of my soul die in that appointment. I have no idea why she was in a job where you're supposed to help people. She seemed to resent the very idea. Story 20. No man will ever want to be with you, and your boyfriend, now husband, will leave you. No man wants a woman who will not give him children when I mentioned that I was not going to have children. Story 21. First session. Severe depression and anxiety. I could barely function. I tell her that I feel guilty because I know that my problems are not that serious objectively. She tells me that I don't actually know that because if I had even a little bit of empathy, I would understand that other people have actually serious problems. I might have a destroyed self-esteem, but even I could tell she was being a jerk. Like, if you want to only deal with serious issues, go become an oncologist instead of being a mental health professional. You knew you were getting into a profession where a lot of the patients have problems that are only in their heads. At the very least, don't hurt us further. Story 22. I went no contact with my abusive ex-parents in 2011. In 2021, after a decade of silence, they were trying to get me under a conservatorship. They had written to the prosecutor and filed paperwork with the help of a lawyer. The process was, first, a preliminary inquiry, then, depending on the results, going to court to deem me legally irresponsible. This was a huge attempt at getting power over me again. In their request to the prosecutor, they wrote about a diagnosis they had entirely made up, turned the fact that I'm poor into a character flaw, used my taking up a loan in 2011 as proof that I was spending money irrationally, and so on. Lots of lies, woven together with some sparse documentation that my sister had given to them because at the time I was still talking to her. It was a huge betrayal, as you can imagine. And the worst part? First, I didn't know it was them. I went through a very inquisitive process, the preliminary inquiry, which consisted of meeting with social workers, having to show them the entirety of my bills and bank account, letting them inspect my home, answering questions about my love life, and they refused to say who had launched the inquiry. Then I went through a psychological evaluation, also without knowing who was at the root of this process. 7 months after going through all of this, I eventually learned that my parents were the ones doing this a few days before the prosecutor found that they had no basis for their request and that the preliminary inquiry proved it didn't need to go any further. This was supremely stressful for me. I had the support of my friends, but understandably I was distraught about the violation of my privacy, of my home even. During those 7 months, it so happened that I was able to have only 2 appointments with my regular therapist. At the first one, I told her all about how worried I was about my autonomy, about not knowing who was doing this, about suspecting it could be my ex-parents, and that my worst nightmare was to be subjected to their abuse again. She nodded, renewed my antidepressant prescription, and that was it. At the second one, I was obviously still terrified. I had just gone through the psychological evaluation, which I thought went well, it later turned out, but was still freaked out that I had to be put under a microscope like that without even knowing why. I was in the middle of a sentence about how, I can't believe I'm left in the dark about this. It's horrible not to know everything about a process that could be so life-changing, when she interrupted me and said, "Okay, we get it now," gave me my prescription and ended the session. I broke down in tears in front of her assistant on the way out. Full sobs. It was my breaking point. I never went back. Story 23. I expressed to her that I didn't want to keep living. She told me other people have it worse. Also, she told me I should buy a Blendtec blender and drink smoothies. This was all in the same session. Story 24. At the time, I was working as a professional equestrian. I was very fit and on a government sports training scholarship. My therapist told me I might be less depressed and stressed if I did some exercise. I told her my job was literally exercise. She said it was not, that equestrian isn't a real sport and that I just sit there. She proceeded to tell me about the time she went on a pony ride, so she knew all about it. I didn't go back. Story 25. It was telehealth, so over the phone, and I could hear him mute the call every time I spoke, and when he'd unmute it, it would always be timed perfectly with his deep exhale of what I'm guessing was a bomb rip. Like, bro, I'm stoned too, but at least pretend. Story 26. My second therapist had me take a questionnaire on a tablet, which is pretty standard, only immediately after she had me retake the same questionnaire on paper because she didn't trust the tablet. Then right after that, she had me verbally go through it with her. She just kept asking me the same things over and over and would never review her notes or any paperwork. Instead, she just wasted my therapy time having me retell her things 8 times. I decided I was done when, in our second session, we had discussed 3 times that my dad died from cancer and that I, in my teens, had to work to support the family. 5 minutes later, she asked me how my relationship with my father is. She had already forgotten he had died, even though I had just been pouring my heart out about it. I decided I didn't want to see someone who was going to tell me how to improve if they couldn't even be bothered to remember my history. Story 27. You need to have some faith that God has a plan for you. I'm as atheist as it gets. Sure, she didn't know it. It was my first session, but what a dumb thing to say. Story 28. She made a comment about my weight, which was not Nor was it ever the reason I sought the services of a therapist. In the next session, she continued talking about my weight, being mindful, and so on. I told her if I wanted to hear about my weight out of nowhere, I'd break my arm or get a gunshot wound and go to the doctor. Story 29, me. So yeah, I'm having panic attacks and I'm really depressed. How do I feel better? Therapist. Exercise. Me. But I already exercise 3 to 4 times a week. Therapist. Exercise more. Me. I have fibromyalgia and arthritis. I can't do any more exercising. Therapist. Take up boxing. Me. I can't do that. Do you have any other suggestions, especially for when I'm in the middle of a panic attack? Therapist. Light a candle.